Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Fry Day, it's French Fry Day, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Fry Day. It's French Fry Day.
David French, welcome back.
Sky, thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
You know, we always have this problem that there's just not enough to talk about when you come on.
I know. We're always straining. We're always straining.
Okay, we are a week and a half into the second Trump administration. There has been a flurry of activity. I mean, it's exhausting just turning on the news. But I want to cut through some of the noise and look at some things that Trump has done or his administration has done, which are not completely unexpected, but really pushing the envelope, maybe even just breaking through it on legality. So a couple things come to mind, and we can flesh these out. One is his executive order ending birthright citizenship, which seems to be in direct defiance of the 14th Amendment and a lot of jurisprudence over the years that has backed up birthright citizenship. And then the TikTok ban, where on a bipartisan level, which is pretty rare these days, Republicans and Democrats in Congress passed this ban on TikTok, and it was pretty watertight. And Trump basically let the deadline come and go and said, well, I'm just not going to do it. I'm just not going to enforce it. And so I want you to unpack some of what it is exactly that Trump has done on these fronts and others. But then I want to get to, can the president just ignore the courts, the Constitution, and the Congress without consequence?
That is, boy, there's so much there, Sky. There's so much there. So let me unpack it. Let's go with the easy part first, and that's TikTok. The hard part is your last question of can the president ignore Congress? Because the answer there is it depends. There's not a exactly hard and fast rule. There are in some areas, but we'll get to that. Okay. So TikTok, here's what happened. There's a lot of confusion around this. So when we talk about TikTok ban, what we're actually saying is not that on my phone right now by federal law, TikTok is not allowed to be on here. What we're saying is federal law prohibits American companies from assisting TikTok, hosting, et cetera. And so if you go to the App Store right now on Apple, and if you go to the App Store, you cannot get TikTok. So in one sense, the ban is being enforced, that it is the American companies are complying with the TikTok ban.
But that's of their own volition.
That's of their own volition, because essentially what's happened is imagine you're a general counsel for a company and you have a law that should be in full force and effect. And your CEO comes to you and he says, Sky, my lawyer, Sky, I hear President Trump is not enforcing this ban. You would say, okay, well, here's the problem. There's penalties attached to violating the law. The law binds you. There's no guarantee that Trump won't change his mind. There's you could face potentially shareholder suits or other suits for risking the company in defiance of the law. So you should just comply. Like you should comply. And so that's what's happening is American companies are complying. And so in that way, the way to look at it is that TikTok isn't banned, but think of TikTok, unless something changes, as being kind of in hospice, that it's going to being unable to update, unable to host in the app stores, et cetera. It's in a slow circling of the drain.
Yeah.
And
okay, I get that.
Yeah.
But I mean, companies tend to be risk averse, and the council of companies are very risk averse. They don't want them to unnecessarily put themselves in a precarious place. That's separate, though, from the responsibility of the executive branch of the government to execute the laws passed by Congress. And my understanding is Congress passed this statute that says TikTok will not be allowed to be aided by U.S. companies or in the United States if it continues to be owned by ByteDance, this Chinese corporation, which has deep connections to the Chinese government. And it gave a provision that if a sale of TikTok was in process, then they could postpone the ban. But that's not what's going on. The president has just unilaterally decided, I'm not going to enforce this law.
Right.
And it reminded me a little bit years ago when states started decriminalizing marijuana, but the federal government still considered it on the books a crime. But there was, I don't know if it was the Obama administration maybe, and then later, but they basically said,
yes,
yeah, it's still against the law, but wink, wink, we're not going to prosecute you anymore. And that there's some discretion on the part of the executive branch on how they enforce various laws. But does that extend to something like this, where Congress passes a statute that's pretty clear in its language and the administration just goes, I don't really care. We're just not going to enforce it?
No. So there is a difference between prosecutorial discretion, which is a classic executive branch authority. In other words, you have an array of criminal laws. You have limited resources to enforce the criminal laws. And what the executive prioritizes for enforcement is generally up to the executive.
Right, because you can't do everything.
Right. But the executive can't say, the marijuana laws are no longer in force or effect. They can say, we're not allocating resources to enforce the laws. So that's a different kind of analysis. But this prosecutorial discretion concept, which actually the Obama administration sort of pushed to its limit with things like DACA and DAPA, where it's saying, hey, we're not actually changing the law here. We're using our prosecutorial discretion to not use deportation proceedings for entire classes of people. But prosecutorial discretion is really supposed to be an individual analysis. It's not supposed to be blanket release from legal obligations. So, but this is not a prosecutorial discretion situation. This is a normal operation of law. Now, the interesting thing is there's a little bit of sleight of hand here because it's not clear how much immediate enforcement would be really required to begin with. In the absence of the kind of voluntary compliance that we're seeing. So where the lack of enforcement would really come in is if we were seeing the private corporations continuing to support TikTok and then the Trump administration not doing anything about that. That would be where you would see a real problem.
Sure, but it just seems weird to me for Congress to pass a law, for the president, at least the previous president, to sign that law, and the incoming president to just go, yeah, I'm not going to do that. Whether or not the corporations are obeying the law, for the executive to say in their constitutional duty, I'm just not going to do it, seems really strange. Now, on the birthright citizenship idea, that's the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, in which the president seems to be saying, yeah, I don't want to do that one either.
Yeah, right. Well, or changing it. Yeah.
Right. So
changing the interpretation unilaterally. Yes.
But what you have in common here is Donald Trump coming into office and looking at existing laws, constitutional amendments, other things, and just like a buffet, picking which ones he wants to accept and which ones he doesn't. And the big question, going back to what I said at the beginning, is I assume this isn't going to stop. This is not
right.
A one-time weird anomaly that the Trump administration is undertaking here. What exists in the law or in the Constitution to stop a president from doing this kind of thing?
That's a very good question. So it's complicated. The answer here is complicated. So let's look at a couple of categories of presidential autonomy. So here would be one that we've already talked about, prosecutorial discretion.
Right.
Congress passes a suite of criminal laws. There's limited resources. Administrations will choose which ones to prioritize. That's a normal operation. There's another category of laws where presidents have, as a practical matter, a considerable amount of flexibility. And that's when Congress has made compliance impossible. So here's in the immigration context.
Yep.
So Congress has passed a law saying you need to detain immigrants under certain kinds of conditions. Mandatory language, must detain. But it has not funded the creation of detention facilities. So you have mandatory detention language, but you have literal impossibility of compliance. So there, the president just has a degree of autonomy and discretion. But then there's a situation like this one, where the language is mandatory. There isn't an issue of limited resources. perhaps even there, in some circumstances, there's been an appropriation of money with a mandatory language that you must spend it. Now, in these circumstances, the president, in theory, should have no discretion. So let's say, for example, Congress appropriated $25 billion to build 5 Virginia-class attack submarines. And if the president says, nah, I only want to build one for $5 billion. No, he does not have that authority. It is mandatory. $25 billion, 5 submarines. That's the rule. Now, that situation, what is Congress's remedy gets very complicated. So in some circumstances, members of Congress or individuals who maybe are affected by or benefit from a law can go to court and get a court order compelling, say, disbursement of the funds or compelling the executive to comply with the law. Now, in that circumstance, that then raises, does Trump obey the Supreme Court?
Right.
So you're beginning to get into that question.
Okay,
right?
This brings up a case that some people may remember from high school history class when Andrew Jackson was president. Let's see, when was this? 1835. The case about the Cherokee Nation in northern Georgia. So John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, issued a ruling in favor of the Cherokees. This was about the Trail of Tears when Jackson wanted to expel Native Americans from various lands and send them west. And the Supreme Court ruled against the president's interests and for the Cherokee Nation. And then it's some debate of whether or not this is apocryphal or not, but in tone, it's correct. President Jackson essentially said the Chief Justice has made his decision, let him enforce it. And the president just ignored what the Supreme Court ruled and decided to expel the Native Americans anyway. And there was no way to stop him. So are we in, and we know President Trump really loves Andrew Jackson, are we in a similar situation where the courts may rule that, sorry, your executive order ending birthright citizenship is utterly unconstitutional, and the Trump administration just goes, so what? Stop us. What are you going to do about it?
I am worried about that. The Jackson story is a little more complicated than the history tells. For example, he seems to have never said something like John Marshall's made his ruling, now let him come enforce it. It's a very complicated. And the Jackson administration was actually diabolically clever in the way that it handled that situation. Very vicious, but not as lawless as we remember. Indefensible, but the popular history and the actual history are just a little bit different. But what I would say is there's no question that we should be concerned about this. And why should we be concerned? Because J.D. Vance, the vice president of the United States, has very clearly outlined circumstances where, for example, he says President Trump should defy the Supreme Court. So, for example, he, in 2021, in a podcast said that there should be terminations of vast numbers of federal workers, and that if the Supreme Court orders them reinstated, that they should defy the Supreme Court. Vance was later asked more about that a couple of years later, refused to back down from it. So we do have, this isn't just some random talk show host or Twitter personality. It's a sitting vice president of the United States. Now, what you then get to is, what can you do? Well, the answer is that the founding fathers would give you is you can impeach and convict the president.
Yeah, you would think so.
But that is, we all know that is not going to happen.
Right.
I mean, what is happening right now? James Madison is looking at Mike Johnson and the Senate Republicans, and he's not spinning in his grave. He's just throwing up all over the place. Like, this is absurd, because his own view of Madisonian democracy was not that Congress would be bending the knee to the executive branch. His version of Madisonian democracy is ambition checks ambition. And what was the ambition that would check ambition? The legislative branch, he thought, would have its own sort of self-respect and its own desire to take its place, rightful place, and to hold its rightful place in the American government. But what's happening right now is the Senate Republicans, the House Republicans, they are operating entirely as instruments of Donald Trump's will.
Right.
They are not thinking. not even a molecule of most of their brains is taken up with any sort of sense of civic responsibility as a member of Congress. They are entirely looking at what's happening in government as their political responsibility as members of Donald Trump's Republican Party to do his bidding. So there goes one of the chief guardrails for presidents is just out the window now, because Congress will not view itself as an independent or not as a separate and in many ways supreme branch of government. So it views itself as completely subordinate to the executive branch right now.
This is a longstanding criticism of the founders, that they underestimated the power of political parties, or at the time what they called political factions, and that people within Congress would feel more loyal to their political party than they would to their branch of government, which is why you see and we've seen this for a long time, members of Congress capitulating to the president of their own party rather than standing up for the constitutional rights of their branch of government. Okay, but here's where it feels like we are today. The best analogy I can think of is resistant bacteria who are resistant to antibiotics. You always, when you get an antibiotic from your physician, they always say, make sure you take all of them, even though you feel better, even though you're healthy, continue the whole course of antibiotics. Because if you don't, the bacteria that are left in your system that haven't been eradicated yet end up being the strongest bacteria, and then they breed and you get this stronger, more resistant form of bacteria, which is bad for everybody. And when you look at what's happened to Donald Trump over the last 10 years, the man was impeached twice. After January, and survived those impeachments. After January 6th and the storming of the Capitol and the violent uprising, he has paid no political price. He's been reelected as president. He was indicted how many times by the courts? For 49 or whatever many indictments he had. He was convicted on some of those cases, and yet there was no price to be paid politically for him. He's resistant to any check you might want to put on him at this point. So what options are really available to either Congress or the court that would deter him from doing anything he wants?
You know, Skye, I mean, you raised just such an excellent point, and sort of this sense of resistant bacteria. I mean, antibiotic resistant bacteria is such a great illustration, because think about how far we've been sliding into normalizing the unacceptable. So 2, 3, 4 years ago, if you were going to ask me, what are some of the biggest concerns you have about, say, a Trump version 2? And I would say, well, the personnel, the people that he would be selecting. And someone would say, like who, right? And I'd say, I could imagine a Trump second term nominating Pam Bondi for Attorney General. That would, and people would gasp, no, not Pam Bondi. I mean, this is somebody who was all in on the election steal effort, not really seen much more as a Trump loyalist than as a really capable Attorney General of Florida. So somebody seen as just coding just as Trump loyalist. So then Matt Gaetz is actually selected initially. Pam Bondi is the second choice, to which Washington issued a sigh of relief that it was Pam Bondi. When 3 years ago, if you said Pam Bondi was going to be the Attorney General, people would have said, surely not. Surely not.
Right.
And so this is
like saying, I'm going to cut off your entire arm, and you freak out and they go, no, you know what? I'm just going to take your fingers. Thank you.
And you're like, whew, thanks. Gosh, I only need 9 fingers anyway. Yeah, you're exactly right. It's a process where you push through into the unthinkable, and then you push past the unthinkable into the doubly unthinkable. And you sit there, and when you get some small partial reprieve from the doubly unthinkable, it takes a minute to realize, wait, the concession by Trump leaves us in barely charted or uncharted waters on unqualified cabinet nominees.
So I think that's a good illustration of the difference. I hear so many people, especially on the political left, freaking out about every last thing Trump is doing, including his nominees, including some of his executive orders, his ending of refugee resettlement. We go on. And yet, and as awful as some of those things are, and they certainly break norms, technically speaking, they're not outside the powers of the president. So if he wants Pam Bondi to be nominated as Attorney General, he has the right to do that.
Sure.
Now, you want Congress, the Senate, to advise and consent, and hopefully saner minds be like, no, sorry, you need to put someone in here. But it's still within his legal constitutional right to nominate an unqualified person to be Attorney General or Secretary of Defense or name your cabinet office. What's different is on these other things we've been talking about, like ignoring the law passed about TikTok or ending birthright citizenship. These are flagrant violations of his oath of office.
Right.
To uphold the Constitution of the United States. And on that front, you're not just breaking a norm, you're breaking the law. Yeah. We have no way of stopping him because he's been impeached multiple times and survived. He has been unceremoniously voted out of office and had the largest temper tantrum the nation has ever seen, bringing us to the point of a constitutional crisis. And I feel like the Republicans, this is a terrible analogy, but I'm sure you remember in Avengers Infinity War, when Thanos is on his rampage and Thor shows up with his, whatever that new axe is of his.
Yes, the axe.
And he thrusts this axe into Thanos' chest to kill him, and Thanos pulls him closer and says, you should have gone for the head. And then he snaps his, like the Republican Party had an opportunity to rid itself of Donald Trump in the second impeachment, and they chose not to convict him. And I think their assumption was what Trump did following the 2020 election was so egregious that surely the American people have now turned their backs on him and they will do the hard work of getting rid of Donald Trump from the political system. He's finished. And they were shocked because the media didn't disown Donald Trump. Many Americans didn't disown Donald Trump. And so within a few weeks, you have Republican leaders like McCarthy and others going down to Mar-a-Lago and bending the knee and kissing the ring. So they didn't get rid of him when they had the chance, and now he's back stronger than ever, and they have no remedy. They have no way of stopping him from just completely disregarding the Constitution.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, they do have a remedy, but it would require a 50 plus people who are currently invertebrates to grow a spine. And that is just not going to happen, at least not anytime soon. Now, it will be interesting to see if Trump's approval rating plummets because of chaos, if there's any kind of economic disruption, and he begins to lose approval rating and he can't run again. You might begin to see that old Washington ambition reasserting itself where, the old saying is that every senator looks in the mirror and sees a president. Mm-hmm. So you might begin to see that raw self-interest creating the illusion of a spine as they will jockey for position to replace Trump. But the bottom line here, Skye, is there's very few Republican senators who truly, genuinely believed that Donald Trump had not committed an impeachable offense. The reality is they were hoping that the Trump's wrongdoing was so obvious and so grotesque that it would end his political career without them having to do anything. And so that was the goal. The goal was to try to end Trump's political career through the force of public opinion while being able to turn to the Republican base when it was your own race and your own primary and to say, I resisted the liberal media's demand for overkill against Donald Trump. I resisted the call to impeach and convict him for action, after he was already out of office. And the thought was, I think, in the few days after January 6th, that we don't have to do Donald Trump has destroyed himself. We don't have to destroy him. But then by the time they learned their mistake, by the time they learned that Trump had not destroyed himself at the base, they then reverted to pure invertebrate form, except for the very small number of senators who voted to convict, because we already knew from Trump's term that when Trump's base stood with him, the Republican senators were not going to stand against him. And so the writing was on the wall the instant the base decided to double down on Trump.
So that reminds me, I forget who said it exactly, a 19th century French politician said, where are the people going? For I must follow them. I am their leader.
Yeah.
I thought being a senator required some level of leadership to be ahead of the people and show them what is good and right and true, and not just put your finger to the wind and find out what do the people want. Is this let's turn the conversation a little bit to the bigger picture, maybe from a Christian perspective. Is this the fundamental flaw of where we are as a society and as our leadership community's flaw is, do we trust the people too much? Did the politicians in Washington, especially the Republican leaders in the Senate, did they trust the American population too much to do the right thing as regards Donald Trump? So they felt like, well, we don't have to risk our own political careers. We don't have to say the hard thing. We don't have to cast the hard vote to impeach him because the people will take care of this. They'll never nominate him again. He's going to disappear. We'll trust the wisdom of the American people. And the American people basically said, hold our beer and watch this.
Yeah.
Like, is that our failure here?
Sky, let's go back to James Madison. I'm going to channel James Madison. I don't know what his accent would be. You know, I've heard various versions what the early, so I'm not going to try it. But here's me channeling James Madison. Dear America, you idiots, we tried to warn you about the dangers of mob rule. Did we not? If you look at the American Constitution, we didn't just check the president, we checked the people. And what was one of our key ways of checking the people? It was we, and maybe this is on us, we thought that the elder statesmen of American public life would operate as a check, and including the Senate. Because remember, they set up the Senate not to be subject to popular vote.
Right.
The Senate was originally selected, by state legislatures. And so the original vision was to check the people as well as check the government. Now, you can look at the original Constitution and you realize they checked the people too much. There was only one one branch of government that had a real popular vote, and that was for House. Senate, no popular vote. They viewed the president would be decided by an electoral college, which is very different from what we have as an electoral college now. They viewed it as, like a council of cardinals almost selecting a pope. Instead, we have a popular vote tied to electoral college counts and things like that. So yeah, the Madisonian answer is, yeah, of course you trusted the people too much. And did we not write thousands upon thousands upon thousands of words about how mob rule can be destructive to republics?
Okay, but I agree with you, obviously. But since the founding generation, we saw changes like the popular vote for senators in each state rather than being selected by state legislatures. And we saw the expansion of the vote with the enfranchisement of women and freed slaves. And, and in the 1960s, the Voting Rights Act, we saw more and more of the American population brought into the democratic process. And it didn't immediately destroy the country. And I think partly because the political parties, despite all of their flaws and foibles, served as a check. Because the way we found presidential nominees was, as the saying goes, those smoke-filled rooms where party bosses would make sure that only certain people were allowed to be nominated for president. There were systems that kept the people from selecting whoever they wanted. There were still these elite barriers that prevented mob rule. But since the 1970s and the modern primary system and gerrymandering and all the other stuff that we've talked about on previous episodes, we've taken away more and more of those barriers. And so in 2015 and 2016, Donald Trump, despite the objections of party bosses in the Republican Party, snags the nomination of the GOP. Despite all of the horrible things that happened on January 6th and all the criminality of Trump's first administration, he snags the nomination again in 2024. So all those checks and balances or barriers that were either instituted with the original Constitution or were put in place by the party bosses are gone. But we still have this romantic idea that the American people have innate wisdom. If you just get enough of them into the system, the outcome will be good. Right.
I mean, I think that the founder's vision was too narrow. To have a House of Representatives as the only, and obviously, what percentage of Americans were even voting for the House? I'm
landowning white men was it.
Yeah. I was teaching a class called the I'm teaching a class this semester called The Legal Philosophies of the American Foundings. And I asked my class, how many of you were talking about how democratic was the original Constitution? And I asked people to raise their hands, how many of you are property owning white males? And I was the only one holding my hand in the air. So I said, there's your democracy. It's just me in this class. So obviously, our democracy was way too narrow in 1787. So yes, we should have universal suffrage of adults. Yes, we should vote for House and Senate. Yes, we should vote for the president. But Sky, nothing about these democratic reforms has removed from the Senate and the House their constitutional obligations to operate as a check on executive power. Nothing has changed that. That if anything, it became more important the more we opened up our government to popular mandate and to popular will. It became more important to preserve the very few institutions that were left as a check on that. And one of them is impeachment. Impeachment is a check. Another one is the advice and consent power. You're seeing a lot of Trump's people saying, well, he won. He's entitled to his cabinet. False. Again, tell that to James Madison. Madison would say, no, you're not entitled to your cabinet. There's entire Federalist papers written about how we're trying to use the advice and consent power to avoid things like favoritism, to avoid things like just collecting a group of sycophants around a president. So again, what's so ironic here, Sky, is I spent years and years and years in a GOP that prided itself on being the constitutional party. I would go and I would give to church groups discussions about the founding of our country and the formation and what checks and balances mean and what is Madisonian democracy. And they're taking notes and they're eating it up. And this is the constitutional party. In 2014, if you asked me, what kind of conservative are you? I would have said, I'm a constitutional conservative. And my Republican friends would have, cheered along with that. But now the Republican Party has apparently decided, well, the times are just too, wokeness is too much of a danger. DEI is too big a problem. We got to fight the left means abandoning, shredding, shedding the constitutional structure, constitutional checks and balances. It's extraordinary.
And it's extraordinarily short-sighted. In a piece you wrote recently in the New York Times, you pulled this quote from John Adams in 1798. He said, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net." What he seems to be saying there is we can't pass laws or have provisions in the Constitution that can guard against completely unvirtuous people. And I think we're kind of discovering that. We all assumed that after 250 years of this republic, that we've created a system that is really robust, resilient, anti-fragile, and it's being tested now against a truly unvirtuous person. And with a Congress, as you pointed out, in which there's no backbone, and it's very precarious. We're not sure if this is going to hold. I don't want to be the sky is falling person, like you hear so much in all the rhetoric around fascism and totalitarianism and the Hitler thing gets pulled out all the time against Trump. I think that can be hyperbolic, but I also don't want to diminish the truly unprecedented nature of the test we are facing as a country and the systems we've created, because we think the Constitution and the law alone will put guardrails on Donald Trump. And yet we've seen rail after rail after rail fail because unvirtuous people were unwilling to take their responsibilities seriously.
That's exactly right. And, and Sky, it's not been a sort of black and white, we were upholding the norms before Trump. And then all of a sudden with Trump, he just blows through them like the Kool-Aid. Do you remember the Kool-Aid commercials? Yeah. Where the Kool-Aid guy just comes bursting through an intact wall. No, we were heading in this direction for a while. And it's this, what was it, Hemingway, that people go bankrupt slowly and then suddenly?
Then all at once. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So we have been going sort of constitutionally bankrupt for a while. And then now it's just really kicked to a new level.
Is there a point, a tipping point, or something you look back on that maybe isn't an acute thing that people felt at the time, but you look at and go, oh, wow, now in retrospect, that was a real turning point that we should have been more alarmed by?
Yes. The Gingrich-Clinton Wars.
In the 1990s.
In the 1990s. So
in what way?
So in a couple of ways. One was this was really the first period of post-Cold War politics where some of the dangers that Francis Fukuyama warned about in his much misunderstood book, The End of History, where in essence, if we don't have the big fight out there, and that we're confronting the Soviet Union, this existential threat, right? And which was coming on after the existential threat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, which was after the horrific national trauma of the Great Depression. So we went through from 1929 till basically 1989. We had about 60 years of what you might call artificially sort of a kind of aberrational sense of national identity and national unity.
Because we had a shared external enemy.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So then you roll into the post-Cold War era, and all of a sudden you begin to see that domestic polarization really increasing.
It was there the whole time, but it was kind of latent. It was latent. Right. And it just burst out. Absolutely.
Yeah. If you look at the big sweep of American history, we're a fractious people, Skye. I mean, we have fought each other more than just the Civil War. Just Google Battle of Blair Mountain in West Virginia, just as one example. So when striking miners and strike breakers fought a literal battle with thousands of people fighting each other in the mountains of West Virginia. I mean, it's crazy. So we have had a lot of fractiousness. So then post-Cold War, you have Gingrich, who really has this view of, and I strongly recommend a McKay Coppins profile that he wrote of Gingrich years ago, McKay Coppins with The Atlantic. And he says, here comes Gingrich, and he says, no, we're not going to use language like we disagree, or you're wrong. It's going to be, you're a Marxist, you're a communist, you're evil, you're vile. So really ratcheting up the political combat. Then you have a Bill Clinton who, the Democrats had a lot of understandable affection for him because the Republicans had won 5 of the previous 6 presidential elections before Clinton. Republicans had won 3 in a row, 80, 84, 88 before Clinton, and not one of those had been close. So Clinton was kind of a political savior at the presidential level for Democrats, but his ethics and morals were problematic, Skye. And so here you had 2 really vicious partisans, Gingrich and Clinton, going at each other hammer and tongs. This is the rise of the cable news, talking heads. You have the first impeachment of the modern era, where you had a Democratic president sort of caught dead to rights on, at the very least, being misleading under oath in a grotesquely inappropriate sexual relationship with a young woman. And the Democrats circle the wagons, and then the Republicans had some high horse elements. But in the meantime, Gingrich is having his affairs. There's all the, right. And so the 90s really do, in my view, there's a jumping off point of modern American extreme polarization starting in the 90s.
Okay, 2 things though. You touched on this, but another factor in the 90s is you really see the rise of 24-hour cable news.
Yes,
CNN had
huge.
been around since the 80s, but Fox News takes off in 96. And Americans now have, if they want it, 24-hour constant vitriol about their political enemies, which only then grows exponentially with the internet and all of that in the late 90s and early 2000s. So that's a factor that was gasoline on this fire. But my question is, I agree entirely with your assessment of that era. I remember it vividly. What happened constitutionally that you think put us on this course? I mean,
it was what happened politically that has constitutional ramifications.
Okay.
So if you look back, okay, let's pull out the lens a little bit more. If you look at Nixon and his, quote, imperial presidency, that led to an enormous number of congressional reforms to try to blunt the power of the imperial presidency in the 1970s. And so you had this sort of moment in the late 70s, moving in the early 1980s, where Congress has really reasserted itself. It has really brought itself back into the conversation as sort of the supreme branch of government. And then you roll through 8 years of Reagan, 4 years of Bush, and you dive into the deep partisan politics of the 1990s. And so then the partisan imperative became so strong, that's when it began to swallow Congress's constitutional role. So, look, I know a lot of Democratic friends who think that the impeachment of Clinton was bogus. But the idea that every Democratic senator would be of one mind of this is a demonstration that, it wasn't until Mitt Romney, first senator in American history to vote to convict a president of his own party. And that's 2019. So here you had a situation where Congress then really begins to become that parliament of pundits, to use my friend Jonah Goldberg's statement. In the 1990s, it's much more what team are you on rather than what are you fulfilling your constitutional role. And your role then becomes more of a political role than a constitutional role. Your role is to support the party of the president if you're a member of his party, and it's to oppose the president if you're not a member of his party. And so you really do begin to see this shifting and morphing. And it's a political shift that has constitutional ramifications, because if you're not going to, for political reasons, assume your constitutional role, there's going to be constitutional consequences for that.
That's a good transition to this piece you recently wrote in the Times, titled "A German Thinker Explains MAGA Morality." I don't think it just explains MAGA morality, but it's really getting at this idea that took off in the 1990s. Part of the reason why those leaders in the 90s could do what they did, not only was it because we didn't have this immediate external threat because the Soviet Union was gone, but it was also because voters rewarded them for it. The demonization of the other side, the voting in lockstep with the party rather than thinking independently, all the Democrats voting to acquit President Clinton, all the Republicans voting to impeach him, like all of that got rewarded by their voters. And your piece helps explain why. And obviously you're applying it to where we are right now. But let's talk about someone that hopefully, I'm assuming most of our listeners have not heard of before, and that's Carl Schmitt. Explain who Carl Schmitt is and his contribution to political thinking.
Yeah, so Carl Schmitt is a German political theorist who joined the Nazi Party after Hitler became chancellor. So I was saying this straight up front. This is who the guy is. And as we talk through this, I want to be super careful, as I was in my column. When I talk about Schmitt and Schmittian sort of analysis, I am not saying that Americans are not, that Trumpist Republicans are Nazis, or that people on the far left are Nazis. He was a political theorist who later became a member of the Nazi Party, but before that time, or right in the early 1930s, in 1932, he wrote a book called The Concept of the Political. And so what Schmitt's observation was, so he was being both descriptive and prescriptive. So his description is that human nature in the realm of politics draws a friend-enemy distinction. So this is what he wrote. He says, let us assume that in the realm of morality, the final distinctions are between good and evil. In aesthetics, beautiful and ugly. In economics, profitable and unprofitable. But in politics, he says, the ultimate distinction is different. The specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy. And so so that's the descriptive. He's saying, look, this is just a truth of human nature. Human nature says we're going to move into a friend-enemy distinction in politics. So here's what's prescriptive. He was also a big critic of small L liberalism. So liberal democracies like the United States didn't think they really could work over the long term because in his view, they're taking on human nature, that human nature is contrary to the aims of pluralism and liberal democracy. And so it's a fool's errand to try to defy this friend-enemy distinction. And in my piece, I wrote, no, wait a minute. The founders, more than 100 years before Schmitt, were very aware of human nature. They did know that human nature in many ways was opposed to pluralism.
Right.
That's why the American experiment didn't just depend on legal structures, it depended on ethical structures at the same time. And what are these ethical structures? These ethical structures are related to what you might call today virtue ethics. So if you're talking about sort of Aristotle's values, or if you're talking about the list of virtues that Benjamin Franklin tried to adhere to, that the founders believed in both liberal democracy and virtue ethics and did not see them as separable. And the best single encapsulation of that is that John Adams letter to the Massachusetts militia, which you read about the, whale going through a net. And so they rebuke Schmitt by saying, of course, they pre-rebutted Schmitt because they predate Schmitt. They pre-rebutted Schmitt by saying, no, you can teach a people, you can model, you can embody these virtue ethics that make pluralism possible. Now, the thing about that Schmitt friend-enemy distinction, because it does match our human nature so much, it's very tempting. It's very tempting to slide into that. And when you do slide into that, it adjusts your total moral frame when it comes to politics, because it means that kindness to enemies becomes weakness. Kindness to enemies becomes cowardice. And support of friends, even when friends might be exceeding their authority, or friends is got the value of loyalty, and loyalty is a supreme value. So your supreme value for your friends becomes loyalty, for your enemies becomes opposition, and that's your supreme value. And that's the political morality that we're starting to see warp our national discourse.
So one of the places where you see this Schmittian kind of base human instinct view of politics at work is in the mafia.
Yes.
Right?
Oh, the mafia is a Schmittian organization, totally, without question.
Where the base currency is loyalty, right? If you are with me, I'm with you and I will do everything for you. If you show any disloyalty, you're cut off, it's over. When you bring that instinct into our constitutional system and you realize that there's a provision like the 14th Amendment offering citizenship to anyone born in this country that doesn't benefit my group, well, then that needs to be defied. Or if major contributors to my political campaign are the largest American investors in TikTok and the Congress just passed a ban on TikTok, well, it's not in my interests or my group's interests to ban TikTok, so I need to defy that law. And it simply becomes about loyalty. You mentioned how Donald Trump in his first couple days in office withdrew Secret Service protection from two of his own former cabinet members, John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, when Iran is actively trying to assassinate them, but he pulled Secret Service protection because he perceives them as being disloyal to him.
Yes.
And so we are entering this era in which it doesn't matter if you're an American. It doesn't even matter if you're part of my political party. It doesn't matter if you're part of my administration. If you show any disloyalty to me, you're out. And that's it. So I can see how that began in the 1990s in a real way, where it no longer mattered that we're all Americans. What mattered is, are you blue or red? Are you Democrat or Republican? But we've now taken it to an extreme where even the law and the Constitution does not get applied equally, and its application is based on personal loyalty to one man. Yeah.
When you combine the January 6 pardons with the removal of security from Pompeo, from Bolton, and now Mark Milley as well, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, when you do that, that's friend-enemy distinction in its almost platonic form.
Right.
For my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law is a one way it's put. But it's even worse than that, because for my friends, everything, for my enemies, possible death, living under extraordinary threat, like that's horrific. I mean, just imagine if something happens to John Bolton or to, Secretary Pompeo or to General Milley. I mean, it's horrifying to think about this, just horrifying.
The part that's bonkers to me, though, I mean, this is immoral on multiple levels. In a weird way, I would almost understand if Donald Trump had pulled Secret Service protection from Democrats. I don't know, from Joe Biden or his family, or from Kamala Harris or someone on the left who came out against him. But these are three men who he hired and worked for him in his previous administration. They're his guys. And he's pulling support and protection from them because he feels like they weren't sufficiently loyal. Why would anyone want to work for this person?
Sky. Sex, money, power, man. I mean, it's, the reality is, when you are in Trump's good graces, if you are part of MAGA, then there is... It's funny because a lot of people who've opposed Trump have been accused of being quote unquote grifters. Oh, please.
Right.
The financial rewards of being on Team Trump and in the MAGA universe are extraordinary.
There's a reason why all those tech giants were in the inauguration, because there is a deep financial interest for them to be supporting Donald Trump.
Absolutely. Just extraordinary, right? Just extraordinary interest in financial interests. And then there's never going to be a shortage of people who want to be close to the Oval Office. Even if it's, the person inhabiting the Oval Office is fully reptilian, like they would want it. So you're never going to lack for people who want to have proximity to the Oval Office. You're never going to lack for people who want access to a lot of wealth and power. And then this is another thing. I mean, I said sex, money, power, like the way in which there is this ethos of libertinism around Trumpism it's palpable, Sky. It is a libertine movement, which is ironic to sort of have so many Christian fundamentalists back it. But you brush up against Trumpism, you brush up against libertinism. This is a very libertine movement. So it's libertine, it's loaded up with money, and it has access to power. And so even though an awful lot of people have been thrown under the bus, some have even gone to prison for him, there's never going to be a shortage of people who will say, I'll be different. I'll be different. I can navigate this. I can do this. I can be the one that emerges from here powerful, wealthy, with a beautiful woman or a great looking guy around my, on my arm, and I'll be okay.
Going back to our original conversation about what checks and balances can possibly be imposed on this president, adding into what we just said, if you're a Republican in Congress right now, and maybe you dare to begin to grow a little bit of a spine, the thought of standing up in defiance of Donald Trump, let alone accusing him of criminality, but that not only would you lose your political career, as we've seen happen to Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and everyone else, Mitt Romney, everybody who's tried to go up against him has lost their political career. But now there's even this possibility of physical threat. Yeah. That I could have my protections pulled if somebody's trying to assassinate me. Or there are January 6th criminals, violent criminals who he pardoned that are out on the street that could seek vengeance for him again. Like, there's real fear in this system as well. It's not just a lack of courage, but it's palpable fear of going against Donald Trump. In our final minutes, if you could, I don't know, have some kind of secret meeting with leaders of Congress, Republican and or Democrat, and you could advise them on the best way to not defy Donald Trump, but the best way to protect the American Republic from irretrievable harm, what would you tell them to do? How would you advise them to navigate this moment, not for their own political interests, but for the best interests of the country?
So the first thing that I would say is you have to understand that this country, far more than we ever realized in my lifetime, runs on the honor system. We do have a lot of laws. We do have a lot of checks and balances. But Adams was right in 1800, and he's right now, that if in the absence of honor and courage, in the absence of these virtues, in the absence of virtue ethics, the system won't hold for long, even though it's a well-designed system, even though it is designed quite well to avoid abuses of power and to check ambition with ambition. it will not hold for long. So if I'm reminded by that quote from Gandalf in Fellowship of the Ring, where that exchange with Frodo about why are we living in such times? And it's not up to us to decide the times in which we live. It's up to us to decide how, I'm butchering this beautiful quote, but you get it's up to us to decide what we do in these times. And Skye, it just sounds so simplistic to say we need spinal transplants, but there's no other answer here. There is no other answer. There isn't a legal ruling that will get everybody out of this. There is nothing other than people are going to have to stand up and stand tall and even risk maybe their lives. And I don't say that lightly. Skye, this has been a reality from day one of MAGA. From day one of MAGA, if you are a public person and you oppose MAGA, you're going to face threats and harassment at a scale that, we've really not experienced much in modern American politics. That's not to say that the left doesn't threaten people. There is absolutely circumstances where the left has threatened and even tried to kill people. But it is a almost universal experience. If you have a public voice, if you oppose MAGA, batten down the hatches. You're going to face threats. You're going to face harassment. It's going to be hard on you. It's going to be hard on your family. And, I think a lot of us look at the past and say we're thankful for the courage of the past because it doesn't require us to be courageous today. That is an old way of thinking, man. Yeah. There is no substitute in this moment for courage. There is no plan path that gets us from A to B without courage. There's just no way to do it without some critical mass of American leaders remembering the honor code upon which this nation was founded.
Okay, along those lines, what would you be telling the Democrats right now? I'm not embedded in Democratic circles much at all, but it feels to me from an outsider's point of view that I don't know how seriously they're taking the loss in 2024, or are they really doing a deep autopsy on what's broken in their party and movement that they fared so poorly against Donald Trump? If they have any chance in 2028 of turning things in a better direction, is there a handful of things you would prescribe that they really need to take a look at to explain where they are?
Well, I think it's absolutely the case that Democrats, not all, but a critical mass of Democratic leaders are engaging in that soul searching. They are. And it's not just that Trump won, it's that Trump won the popular vote.
Right, exactly.
That's actually more important in some ways than him, because a lot of Democrats were resigned to the idea that the quirks of the Electoral College could cost them the election in 2024. I did not talk to a single Democrat before the election who said they thought Trump would win the popular vote too.
Right.
That shook people. And so there's an awful lot of people who are now doing what is overdue, and they're saying, we took the path of least resistance with our activist base and just basically yielded to them on everything. And obviously that ended even before November 2024. I mean, Kamala Harris, who did not run the same race she ran in 2019 and 2024. So already the Democratic Party was moving away from some of its extremism. So you're definitely seeing that, but at the same, which is a constructive response to Trump, and sort of saying, what is it that we did that made so many Americans vulnerable to Trump's message? What were some of the things that we did where Trump had sort of real opportunities to exploit? What did we do that blunted our advantage over Trump on character? And there's a lot of rightful anger at Joe Biden right now. Mm-hmm. I do not think that if you're a hardcore partisan Democrat, I don't think you may appreciate how much Joe Biden's conduct blunted the character argument against Trump. Because it was not a character move to run for president again. It was not a high character move to try to conceal your true condition from the American people. That was a very low character move. That was dangerous, to conceal your condition from the American people and then to have it displayed in the biggest public forum imaginable at this debate That was not a high character move.
Yeah. He gave a lot of ammunition on the whataboutism front, for sure.
But I also think a lot of Democrats are maybe a little too cowed by Trumpism right now because they're overreading the election results. It was not the case that Trump won, in my view, because let me put it this way. Inflation and the border were far more consequential to Trump winning than wokeism or anything else like that. And so I think what the Democrats are doing, there's some constructive stuff saying we have to move to the middle. Some of it's just ridiculous and dumb, like we need our own Joe Rogan.
Right.
No, that wasn't it, right?
Right.
And then some of it is they're literally cowed by Trump a bit. And so where you're actually seeing the more effective opposition to Trump is in courtrooms, is from lawyers, less from the politicians right now. Because it is true that the Democrats are in a soul-searching moment. They're in a bit of disarray. But my advice to them is stay focused on the main thing. If you're chasing all of these ideological trends on Twitter or the Twitter beefs or fights, you're doing the wrong thing. Because if you look at the last 20 years of American politics, we have been through cycle after cycle of quote unquote realignment, where, in 2004, it was going to be the Bush majority, permanent majority. 2006, Democrats win. 2008, coalition of the Senate with Obama. Then 2010, Tea Party. I mean, we've gone back and forth at a rate that exceeds the way we've been doing it in the past. Why? Because unlike in past political cycles, neither party has solved for the problems that Americans are most concerned about. Trump hasn't done it.
Right.
And so the party that can solve for the problems Americans are concerned about, history teaches us, is the party that enjoys a period of power. Whether it's the Republican Party after the Civil War, whether it's FDR and the Democrats after the onset of the Great Depression, whether it's the Republicans winning 5 out of 6 presidential elections at the height of the Cold War, the party that was seen to have solved for the key problem of the moment gets a period of power. We've had 20 years of back and forth seesaw changes of power. And every time, Sky, you'll go through months after the election where it's like permanent realignment. You lost. We're in charge now. And they go chasing off onto their ideological subcategories and niches and don't solve for the main thing. And they're booted out of power. And then we get a new realignment.
Yeah. What's interesting about that framing of history is each of those significant periods of one party domination, whether it's the Civil War and post-Civil War or the New Deal or the Cold War era, like there seems to be a significant leader that catalyzes that thing, whether it's Lincoln or Roosevelt or Reagan. I think some people thought that was going to be Obama. My concern is maybe it's Trump. Maybe Trump is that person for this new era, and we are in this kind of politics for the next 30 years, even after he's gone. But I don't know. I hope not. But it seems to me that whether it's the Democrats or some other startup party, we need a catalytic leader who can address the problem of this era in a reasonable way that most Americans will back. But I don't think we've seen that kind of leadership in the last 20 years.
Here's what we know about the American people. If you can take care of the main thing in their view, you've got a lot of leeway to be a pretty bad guy.
Right.
Bill Clinton had 69% approval rating when the Lewinsky story broke. He ended impeachment with a 73% approval rating. Why was that? Inflation was low. We had a budget surplus. The Cold War was over. Like Americans' main needs, they felt were being met. And so Donald Trump could be just as disruptive as he is right now. But if unemployment stays at 3%, if inflation stays at 2%, if he can bring down the interest rate, the American people will likely give him all the room he wants. And then again, this guy goes back to why the founders didn't fully trust popular government, because we're likely to give a pass to demagogues and authoritarians if they can meet our material needs, or if we perceive them as meeting our material needs.
Bring down the price of eggs and the kingdom is yours.
Right.
David, thank you for your thoughtfulness, for your writing, and for coming back on the show again this month and this illuminating conversation. Hopefully we have happier things to talk about next time.
Thanks so much, Sky. I always enjoy it, even if the topic is a little grim. But you know what's not grim? Severance season 2 so far is outstanding.
My wife and I just started season 1 because I have to confess I haven't watched it.
Oh, you've got a lot to look forward to.
I do. So maybe we'll talk about that next time. Save a little time on that front. All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you for being a Holy Post Plus subscriber if you are. And David, we'll see you next month.
See you next month, Sky.
French Friday is a production of Holy Post Media, featuring David French and me, Sky Jatani. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This show is made possible by Holy Post patrons. To find out how you can become a Holy Post patron and to find more common good Christian content, go to holypost.com.